I mean, I think that's another important point about Satanism is that it's a movable feast, and so I don't think for a second you suggest that the version you're presenting is the definitive version. There are a series of different versions, and so one principle of Satanism is that it's something very personal, and that it does, vary according to the individual. I mean, I'd certainly agree with you that the version that you're describing is something that I find very evocative and I think is very interesting, and I think it's massively caught up in the Western cult of the individual. What matters about Western culture, and I'd be inclined to agree that a lot of how Satanism has been presented within kind of the contemporary sort of cultural landscape has been dominated by other versions, which are perhaps a bit less. I mean, do you think the version you're describing is particularly European, or?
I would say British or English, certainly. But again, I think to the North American mindset, that adds to this sort of idea of the aristocracy of the spirit. Because there's something about the North American mind that associates Englishness with a certain level of sophistication
and villainy.
Right, all the great villains are English.
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's fair to say that sort of British actors have been making a very good living from Hollywood for a long time now, from being stereotyped as the bad guys. Which I think is interesting as well, because you then get into what you're interrogating there is, what your cultural ideas of sort of virtue and vice are, and it's certainly. I mean, my sort of dark on the road to Damascus, I guess, to a certain extent, was about identifying the way in which cultural villains, many of which are defined by Hollywood. Your classic cultural hero is a guy who's got a big square jaw. It's not very interesting, not very bright, and sorts everything out with his fists. And so there's a sort of point at which you're sat there at however many years old, 8 or 9 years old, and there's the sort of the evil villain, and he's got some kind of sophisticated plan of like taking over the world, and you kind of at one point you think that could work. That sounds. I like this guy. I prefer this guy to the arsehole. The arsehole keeps punching people.
Right. And again, I think that's central to the Miltonic romantic myth, or treatment of the myth of Lucifer, is again, I think what you're getting at is heroes don't always win. Heroes are sometimes, or oftentimes, cast as the villains. Good and evil are sort of subjective, and the victors get to be the arbitrators of that. Satan, who's cast down to hell, by an omnipotent being, is ultimately going to be that. He's going to be castigated, he's going to be vilified. But again, that's what's so appealing about the myth, is that he is doomed. That's what makes him Promethean. That's what makes him actually excel Prometheus, as far as I'm concerned. Because Prometheus, his suffering ends, but with Satan, it's eternal.
Is it maybe appropriate at this point to just go through, in your own words, and obviously the Paradise Lost is quite a long book, so briefly, what is Satan's story, as far as you're concerned? What what's admirable? What happens?
So Satan, or Lucifer, again, a very princely figure. As Milton says, one of the highest, if not the highest, angel in heaven. Ultimately challenges God, the Almighty. In Paradise Lost, the reason why is because God appoints his only son to be the universal king of the cosmos.
His only son being J.C.
That's correct. The Messiah, the Son. And Satan challenges that. So he rejects that. He calls it prostration vile. And he refuses to pay knee tribute to this. And so he enlists a third of heaven in a rebellion. Of course, it's doomed to defeat. He's cast down into hell. but he remains dauntlessly defiant.
Does he know it's doomed to defeat?
I mean, you could debate that. I mean, certain critics have said that in heaven, at least, he seems to have believed that perhaps he could be victorious, that perhaps God's credentials are exaggerated. But certainly by the time he is cast down into hell, which is how the story opens, books 1 and 2 of Paradise Lost are in hell after the war is lost. At that point, certainly he knows it's a doomed endeavor, but he refuses to submit or yield, as he says. He has an unconquerable will. So even though he cannot win, he's not going to submit to this. You know, he's not going to beg forgiveness. And that's what's appealing about it. That's what makes it principled, really. Is because he knows he cannot win. You know, God is God. He's the Almighty. He's defined by brute force. So to challenge that is inherently principled.
And I suppose just to sort of, you know, kind of highlight them more, how does that contrast with a Christian perspective?
I think the Christian perspective presents the story as far too neat.
On a more personal level.
Well, the Judeo-Christian tradition is that Satan is simply evil personified. And it creates this very abstract, sort of cosmic principle almost. But once you start to explore the story and explore the motivations in there, and Satan becomes a more human figure, you know, with feelings, with a sense of injured merit, you know, which is referred to as in Paradise Lost, things become more complicated. And so once you give it this grand epic treatment, like Milton did, I think inevitably the devil starts to become increasingly sympathetic.
I think there's an element of that. I mean, in my study of the devil appearing in various kind of artistic and cultural fields, you know, books, whatever, mythology and so forth, is he has a habit of escaping from the pages.
Absolutely.
It's like, yes, you know, once you invoke him, once you give him a personality, he creates problems, and the problems are always interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think to a certain extent, and you find that in the mystery plays, the medieval mystery plays, you find that in all sorts of areas. You find that going back as far as Anglo-Saxon translations of Genesis and so forth. Once you start to give the devil a personality, once you start to sort of talk about this as anything more than in the most childish, authoritarian terms, and I think that's a point worth making as well, is that authoritarianism is childish. It's, I think we were talking about the other day about the way in which you have, childish action films. You know, when I say childish, I mean they're aimed at adults, but they're childish. They have fixed fights. It's boring. You know what's going to happen. There's no nuance. There's no real tension to it, because childish minds like fixed fights. The minute the fight isn't fixed, then things get interesting, and the minute things get interesting, the devil escapes.
Mm-hmm. I think that's certainly something that's absolutely central to this debate over Milton's Satan. The famous line from Blake is that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. That Milton may have been a Christian overtly or superficially, but the regicide in Milton, the Republican regicide in Milton, couldn't help but sympathize with and identify with the ultimate would-be regicide, the arch-rebel, Satan.
Yeah.
Right, who challenges the king of the cosmos.
Because it's very, when you try and impose these kind of sort of political views on the kind of religious hierarchy, then things do get complicated, don't they?
Absolutely.